Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Byline with Ben Dennis. Have you ever wondered why politicians say the things that they say? How much of it is politically motivated? How much of it is all about just being reelected? How much of it is actually getting things done so that their constituents, folks back home, can actually have a better life, have better roads to drive on, have better access to health care, and again, how possibly to raise money? Well, I found the right person for the job. He's a friend of mine. His name's Michael LaRosa. Michael has made his way through politics throughout his career, working with the Bidens on the campaign trail in 2020, and also ultimately all the way up into the White House as press secretary for former First Lady Dr. Jill Biden. He also hails from rural Pennsylvania, a trait that I share with him. He has a great amount of insight into the development of why certain communication strategies are deployed, how they're crafted, who is consulted, how much the actual principal, if you will, the leader contributes into that messaging, and who some of the stakeholders are that they answer to, namely, yes, the voter. Well, we talk about the timing as well of when certain political messages are put out, how far in advance of certain elections, whether it be coming from the White House or whether it be coming from those who may be campaigning or just were sworn into office. How much of political communication is about persuasion, but also mobilizing voters, mobilizing donors, persuading donors to write a check. We also go behind the scenes of the White House and the East Wing. What used to be the East Wing, it's demolished now, and the priorities that the former First Lady Jill Biden wanted to set, what she did not possibly have any interest in, as he describes it, and how the team had worked to advance the Biden agenda, again, from his perspective. So some good unveiling of the curtain, if you will. And Michael is currently a partner with lobbying firm Ballard in Washington, D.C. Ballard describes himself as providing strategic services in government affairs and in public affairs. And I really wanted to find out from his perspective what this all comes down to. Does it come down to instilling trust? Does it come down to being the better communicator, better than your opponent, better than a Republican? If you're a Republican, better than a Democrat, an independent, trying to break this mold and rising above everybody else. I'm also fascinated in how social media is not only changing the way people consume political messaging or any type of message in order to persuade someone in the public arena, but also how politicians are adjusting to this too, including trying to establish that trust when it seems you can find an influencer who you can trust pretty quickly online right now because they are bouncing back the views that you already believe, that they're reflecting something that may already be instilled inside of you. We also dive in on the relationship between the press and public officials as well. Access to information, but also, how politicians might want to control the narrative. We get into a lot of it, and I hope that this helps unveil what is really going on behind the scenes on Capitol Hill and the White House before you're told from the podium X, Y, and Z. And we're going to be pushing this out right around the time of the State of the Union, too. So, President Trump is going to be giving his big primetime speech to the country in Congress in front of the Supreme Court and other guests inside of the House chamber. And a lot of folks will be wondering where he is trying to claim success, where analysts think otherwise, or vice versa. What kind of policy agendas might he want to set up front? How will that messaging be delivered? This is all being crafted behind the scenes, and I hope my conversation with Michael gives you an idea into what's really going on right now. So let's dive into it. Michael, I appreciate you joining Byline. I know that we've had many friendly conversations over the years, whether it be dinner or poolside. However, I did want to get your insight right now as we're trying to give folks a leg up, know a little bit more about politics than maybe somebody down the street. And I'm trying to get some answers for them from power players, people who are really in the know in Washington and across the country. I know that you grew up in rural America like I did too. You made your way all the way to the White House as a communications pillar. So the first question I really have from you is, when you were press secretary for the First Lady, how different is White House communication from campaign trail communication?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think when you're thinking about a campaign communication versus, let's say, executive communication, right? The executive is trying to communicate strength, power through performance. They have a record that they want to defend because that leads to trust. And they want to establish more trust, but they want to keep trust as well. And they want to show that their record is competent, whether it's a private company executive or executive of a state, a governor, or the president. And those roles, specifically like at the White House or a governor or any kind of executive, their words have ramifications that campaign communications do not. So their words can affect military decisions or political decisions, market decisions, market reactions, in all of those cases, shareholders, things like that. On a campaign, part of the point of communication is to develop controversy. You're kind of striving to get attention through persuasion, mobilization, but you also are trying to be more aggressive and more risk averse than you would in the White House. Now, what I would say is the campaign was so much fun because she really leaned into media, and we did a lot of interviews, a lot of free media. That was part of the asset of working for the spouse. It was not like a 2-for-1 thing, but it was like 2 surrogates. And we could, in a crowded race for a Democratic primary, we could perhaps build up free media with her because she could get a little bit of a crowd at coffee shops and bars and museums and libraries and schools around the country where we would go to meet voters. And there was a little bit more risk on the campaign, I would say. When we got to the White House, it was much more choreographed.
Well, let me piggyback off of that too, because obviously you had mentioned once you're in the White House, control the levers of power at that point. You got elected. You're now, controlling the executive branch, but obviously you still have a desire to stay relevant. You want to make sure that you're conveying strength, as you had mentioned, but I understand that there's still some narrative control that's still going on. Yeah. At what point does governing communication start to overlap with political messaging? How long, past January the 20th inauguration day, does that really start to happen, and what does it look like?
No, I would say it never goes away. The permanent campaign is always there for a president or a senator or a governor. In theory, they should be focused on policy, but of course, politics infiltrates everything because every decision they make or every PR decision or every PR move or every policy move has short-term political consequences and long-term political consequences. And those consequences impact donors and industry who also are donors. So there's a lot of threading the needle because there's so many constituencies to keep happy. Jill Biden's role as the spouse, she what I like to say, developed a third way for the first lady. As people know, there's sometimes these models of the first lady who's an activist or the first lady who's much more ceremonial. She took a tack that was somewhere different. First of all, she kept her job, which was the first for any first lady. So she taught full-time at a community college. But they don't always like that I say this or describe it this way. But our East Wing really functioned as a continued campaign, as a continued surrogate operation within the White House. So we would do the same thing we did on the campaign, which was to go out and champion him, the president, his agenda, his accomplishments, his goals, re-election campaign, fundraising, things like that. And everything we did was rooted in how can we help him. She didn't really develop her own sort of policy agenda like some first ladies do. Everything was much more focused on what the West Wing needs. And to that extent, we were very integrated with the West Wing because we could go out on the road more freely than the president.
Whose decision was it to roll with that format? I mean, to your point, there was no Be Best campaign. There was no, Michelle Obama's nutritional campaign for kids in school. So whose decision was it to, roll with the political punches?
Yeah, and it was actually sort of a point of contention that would bring the senior staff together, and we'd go There was like 3 different weekends that we went to Camp David to sort of strategize over, is it important for her to be defined by one role? Does she want to be defined by one particular cause or passion? The answer was no. In the end, she did not, but it was considered. And the reason why was because everything she does is more as a campaign spouse than it is as an activist spouse. So she has passions. She had passions. But everything we did was to go promote the Build Back Better deal or the vaccinations all across the country.
Listen, when I was in
office.
Richmond, I remember covering with the ABC affiliate WRC at the time. She came to VCU Health Center, and that's exactly what she was campaigning on. The vaccine rollout.
That was our first actual physical trip, going to Andrews Air Force Base and then going on a plane and going to Richmond. So it was our first out of town visit. And that took on a life of its own. And it was something that, we never anticipated her playing a huge role in. Of course, that was a crisis that came up and it impacted her time there just the way like a 9/11 would impact, Mrs. Bush, or events trigger routes in how people pursue their roles. And that was certainly a part of it because we spent so much time crossing the country. Every time a new vaccine would come out for a different age group or anything was just approved, we would go out on the road and promote it. And we spent a lot of time that first year doing that.
As we move toward the midterms right now, historically speaking, when does the tone start to change from the White House? Right now, as critics even from Republican factions are saying, the president isn't, going on the stump right now and propping up candidates right now. Some folks are scratching their heads if the White House should be doing more in order to, try and maintain the House. As it seems right now, the Senate's going to be maintained by the Republicans. When does the tone start to change intentionally to really ramp up the messaging to advance your political agenda ahead of the midterms?
Well, I think it always depends. I mean, I think you're probably going to see a change in intensity over the summer, in July and August. I also, depending on whether the Republicans decide to hold a big midterm convention, which hasn't really been done in a long time. So they're going to try to nationalize the election and make it a referendum. What's unique, though, is most incumbents during midterms really stay away from getting involved. I mean, they'll do fundraising and behind the scenes stuff, but most candidates and incumbents want to kind of put some distance between themselves and the White House, especially if it's underwater in approval ratings the way the Biden White House was and the Trump White House is currently. So it's an interesting dance, but he's an unusual president and he's an unusual political actor because he never follows conventional rules or traditions, even when it comes to the team sport of politics. He wants the election to be at him. They've kind of said that. They've gone out and said he is going to travel. He is going to treat every day like it's a presidential campaign, and he wants the candidates to make this a referendum on him, which is really unusual, but I kind of respect the running into the fire kind of mentality.
We'll go back to what you were talking about, though. Why do presidents typically take a backseat during the midterms?
Because governing is always harder than campaigning. And after you spent 2 years campaigning, the rhetoric turns into reality.
You have a job to do.
There's a lot less voters, constituency groups, industries who are pleased after 2 years of choosing and prioritizing which policies to pursue, which regulation to pursue, which legislation to pursue. And so, as you develop a record, public opinion changes. And really for President Biden, it started changing right around August of 2021 when the when the bombing at Abbey Gate occurred.
So let me ask this. When you're crafting a message, how much of it are you speaking to voters? How much of it are you possibly trying to develop a narrative that, talking heads on cable news networks will chime in on? What does that look like?
I think it's situational. You have to consider your audience first, as you said, like, who are we trying to what are we trying to do? Are we trying to persuade? Are we trying to inform? Are we trying to raise money? So it depends who the audience is. And once you figure that out, then you have to decide Are we trying to persuade? Are we trying to mobilize? Are we trying to do something completely different with the message? And, campaigns can take more risk and they can be more aggressive. Again, going back to the original question, I think with message development for a principal in government or an executive, it's about earning trust or facilitating trust. And you do that by mostly talking about your accomplishments and your record to show that you're competent and you can be trusted, and that you can show people at home believe that the person that is running the office is competent, that they can run the country competently, and that they get people like me. That's their ultimate goal. But to me, I always think about something different. I think about everything you do and say forms an impression in people's minds. How my boss would deliver a speech, whether it was teleprompter or just notes, impacts the impression of her and of her husband. And impressions are hard to change. So that's why when you are communicating information, whether it's new or old, or tone, style, her appearance, venue, all those things matter because they all tell one story, but they're communicating a single message to either a voter in this case. Let's just say voters.
I mean, first impressions are tough. I get it. But,
They
but
are.
when you're,
And
go ahead, Michael.
no, I was just going to say, and most people at home, most voters only ever see our candidates or our politicians through one lens, and it's through a television screen. Now it's a little bit more than a television screen. It is computer screens and phone. Exactly.
For those who are just listening and not watching, I waved my iPhone.
But the rules are still the same, right? So everything you do and say forms an impression. And it's up to you to really drive either the message or the news that you want people to take away, because that's ultimately how they form their opinions on voting.
One thing that stands out to me during your time working in the White House for the former First Lady was that more eyeballs were going on phones. They were on social media. Folks are increasingly listening to talking heads, people who are not trained journalists, right? Who have ethical standards. And some of the algorithms are picking up those folks, right? More than they are journalists. So, how did the communication strategy change at that time when more people were going to social media where there was more misinformation and you had to really convey your message clearly? What were some tactics you deployed?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I mean, we had a blended approach. So whenever we had something new on digital that we wanted to target for a digital audience, we might start by take the content and the product and give it as an exclusive to a more legacy media outlet. For example, and this wasn't a message, but this is the first thing that came to mind, when something we did with the cat, we did for a online site called the Dodo.
I'm aware of it, yes. Plenty of animal lovers follow them. They document animals being rehabilitated from bad situations, right?
Okay, well, I didn't know that part, but I knew that it's a content creation that's followed by a lot of animal
Yes.
lovers, and
Yeah.
and now I follow it. But at the time when we filmed something for the Dodo, some video content with Dr. B and Willow, the cat, in the White House, and it was a great video. It kind of told the story of how Jill met her with actual video footage that I had from my iPhone, and we infused it into this little mini doc. But we had it debut on Good Morning America, which is like such a big bang for your buck, because you're driving people to a platform that already has followers, and you never know what kind of subscribers or followers you're going to get from a big Good Morning America hit. While morning TV isn't what it used to be, it's still, has a significant audience of various demographics, right? To drive people to the content and the product.
So I think that's an interesting point that you made. You identified your audience, right? And you crafted the message as a result. I also...
Well, you have to be careful, though. You don't want to tailor or pander based on your audience, but you do want to make sure, even if the First Lady was speaking to a private or to a specific group, we travel with reporters, and we know that her audience is not just the people in the room. Her audience are people who are going to see a clip of her on local TV when she comes to town or on the evening news if she says something controversial. And those form impressions, which is why it's important that you don't for an audience, but you understand who your audience is. And it's not necessarily the people right in front of you. It's not necessarily the people you have to convince. It's the people you don't want to turn off.
What were some of the big takeaways, strengths that you learned when working in the House of Representatives that you brought to the White House?
Well, so I spent 7 years as a TV producer before I went to Capitol Hill to work in the Senate and then the House. So I had a very different perspective than anybody else on the Biden presidential campaign or even in the Biden White House. Treated the media much more as a hazard, where I always treated it more as an opportunity.
Give me some examples. How did they treat it as a hazard? And was it
Oh my
because,
God.
and was it,
How
and
much
was it,
time do you have, Ben?
but was it viewed as a hazard because of the subject who was going in front of the cameras and they didn't trust the president?
Well, I think there was a lot of that. I think there was a lot of when you don't trust your own principle, you are less accessible to the press. And when you're less accessible to the press, the less benefit of the doubt you get. And they operated in like a bunker when they didn't have to. He had so much goodwill going into the White House, but they were scared of their own shadow when it came to him with everything. And I don't know if that had to do with his age or just not being able to trust him to stay on message or whatever. But in my view, Joe Biden's strengths were his natural ability to connect with people, sometimes through emotion and through grief, but through natural ways and organic ways. And the more control you take in the communication process, the less opportunities there are for the principle to be authentic. Let's put it that way. But then there's the tactical side, right? They were just naturally suspicious and skeptical of every request from every reporter. And it led to a degree of hostility that, again, was not helpful to the boss in the end, because when he needed the press the most, the press decided to put their foot on the gas and they didn't take it off. But he had no goodwill because he did not treat the press very respectfully. They weren't very accessible. And that was a big problem, because if people are doubting you and your abilities, you have to show. You just can't tell. And they weren't showing and telling.
You talk a lot about just now your own personal experience in the White House, in the Biden White House. So take the veil back here. Ring the curtain up.
Oh, I just did.
What's the biggest misconception? The reason I ask, let people know who may not, be privy to some of this information all the time. Maybe they're not political junkies, but they do want to find out how political messaging is crafted. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about how messaging decisions are made?
Misconception. Well, I guess I would want to know what the perceptions are first. What would you say the perception is?
Well, maybe let's take one example here, a hypothetical. Maybe someone is just naturally skeptical to any type of political messaging whatsoever. They're just looking for my vote. Next election, and they'll move on. Is that a misconception? Or what's the good intent behind some of the political messaging too?
Well, the good intent is based on your goal, right? Are you trying to persuade? Are you trying to motivate? Are you trying to inspire? Are you trying to raise money? It depends what your goal is with every message. Sometimes, and I learned this a little bit working for a spouse, messages are sent through fashion, and the things she would wear would get interpreted, whether rightly or wrongly. And so it's not just what you're crafting verbally in every sentence that is uttered, but it's the visual that you're communicating as well. And that's why there's so many. The presidency in and of itself is so powerful because of the imagery and its ability to be this home court advantage unlike any other place. And you can speak from the Oval Office or the East Room or the South Lawn or Rose Garden or Air Force One or outside of Air Force One. And so those things are so powerful and people feel them. It's like when we started to travel a lot at the White House, one thing I kept reminding my bosses, and they did not always like the reality, but the reality was When the blue and white plane comes to town, it's a big deal in small towns like where you and I are from in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Like when we landed in Allentown, or when we landed in Palm Springs in particular, I remember those towns don't see big military planes, big blue and white, the president or the president and his wife coming to town very often. And the news media, especially the local media, loves the ability to capture the plane landing, to capture her walking down the steps and greeting some of the local mayors and local community members.
It feels like access, right, for folks who don't necessarily can get in touch
Well,
with the
yeah,
folks.
again, remember, we only get to 99.99% of people don't get to meet these people,
Right.
these politicians. We only get to see them through one lens, through a screen. And so those visuals are so important because everything is examined and everything forms this impression of people.
Let me ask a little bit about in an election year, is it harder to maintain discipline in political messaging during election year than off years? Or are you just always on? You're constantly trying to turn out good communication?
Well, I think campaigns can be more proactive, and you can use the flourishes of rhetoric and a little overstatement to sort of motivate people, appeal to people's emotions. And there's more tendency to go off script probably in a campaign. Whereas when you're in government, when you're in the White House, you are, first of all, more risk averse, and you are much more focused on some specific policy area that you're trying to promote. And I would say that that's probably the case with everyone. You know, then, especially when your record is being examined, you're often on defense a lot, so you feel defensive. And that was also a communication tool, is how her body language contributed to the messages she sent, and her tone of voice. And did she come across defensive, unnecessarily defensive when sitting down for an interview? All distracts from any substantive message. So it's just as important to be mindful of those things as well, because otherwise the goal, maybe to persuade or inform, is overshadowed by other distracting things like the tone of her voice or a very defensive, hostile answer.
Now, obviously, the former First Lady was in politics for decades, just by association with her husband, the former president. With majority in the Senate. So let me ask this.
Yeah.
If someone is initially coming into Congress, even if it is a spouse, someone who's just elected for the very first time, are they getting media training? Are they getting some of that behind the scenes before they go in front of the cameras?
No. I mean, that's kind of you'd be better, a better bang for your buck is to hire people who know how to do that stuff, to train and to give sort of interview advice, media relations advice. And I think that was something that they really appreciated in me when they hired me on the campaign and kept me, because I was sort of unusual for the spouse. I'm much more political, but also I had a background in television and sort of image. And they liked the fact that for a first lady, or I'm sorry, for a political spouse who traditionally did not like public speaking, it was an evolution with her. She hated it in the 87 campaign, and she rarely did it when he ran. She did it more in 2007, more as the second lady, but she really didn't embrace it. And while she's a teacher and enjoys the classroom, she's an introvert. She's not an extrovert like her husband. She doesn't enjoy the kibitzing part of politics that politicians enjoy.
Do first ladies really need to be that way, to be in front of the cameras, if the president is effectively communicating?
It's a supportive actor role, right? And while she had such a front row seat to history, to so much history, since she started dating him when he was a senator, to getting married, to several campaigns, to being vice president, and then this final campaign in the White House, she's had such a front row seat to so much history, and she knows so much. And Jill is very soft spoken and always kept her cards very close to the chest.
Even among her staff?
Sometimes you knew when her wheels were turning and she was developing opinions, but she rarely said them out loud, especially if they were confrontational. But no, she wasn't. It was almost like you couldn't underestimate her, because she picks up on a lot. She has actually pretty good instincts. But she herself would say she's not like a natural communicator to the public, and she never thought of herself as such.
What were some of
But
her
I
biggest
thought that
strengths in communication?
her biggest
Yeah.
strengths? I thought it was just the fact that she wasn't so programmed and robotic and rehearsed the way so many politicians are. Her authenticity came out because she had sort of like this northeastern Philadelphia accent when she would say different words, and people in Iowa loved it. People in South Carolina, they couldn't get enough of like her northeast accent, which I didn't really think about until I started working.
I don't really hear it, but we grew up in the Northeast.
More from the yeah, and she's from Pennsylvania as well. And there would be ways. She had a line in a stump speech where she would use the term, the word coffee, and the way she said it, people would just like they were sort of endeared to it. And she was very charming because she didn't come across as a robotic, programmed sort of Stepford.
And that's a strength.
I thought it was a strength for her. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I don't see how it's going to be a strength for anybody if you appear as a robot.
Well, exactly. And I think that's why you see a lot of politicians really trying to lean into. Now, it looks gimmicky sometimes because they're doing it still from a script.
Mhm.
And I think that's the problem. When there's a script involved, politicians are not actors, and they think they can memorize a script or read from a script. No, that's not how you communicate authentically to voters. You have to be in a position where you can organically communicate and have a conversation with people, not talk at them. And that's a big difference.
Let me ask, I'll piggyback off of that. As Democrats are crafting their final message heading into the summer, when people are actually starting to tune in, you're right, on the campaign itself for the midterms, we're constantly glued into politics, but regular, folks that aren't, they don't tune in, as you mentioned, until later in the summer. And Republicans are also crafting their message too. What do you think the biggest successes are going to be on the stump for Democrats? And can Republicans actually convey that they're getting stuff done right now? And how?
The Republicans' job is a little easier. What they need to do is to sort of illustrate a striking contrast. You might not be totally happy with us, but they're crazy and they are extreme, and they say all kinds of stuff that make them out of touch that you don't want anything to do with. And sometimes that's enough. I mean, we did that in our midterm in 2022. Democrats really focused on trying to disqualify the Republican candidates because they were bad candidates. Candidate quality was a big thing that year. Dr. Oz and Kerry Lake and a bunch of others from Nevada. There are a bunch of candidates who were Republican candidates in really close races, who we were really able to sort of either disqualify or sort of poke holes into their armor. And that is one strategy usually for incumbency. And so I expect Republicans will be doing a lot of that. But the one thing I was going to say about our midterm that defied conventional wisdom and that Republicans are hoping to defy this year is that, everybody thinks the economy is such a driving factor of elections and voting behavior. And as you can tell, I'm a big actually proponent of believing in just simpler ways that voters make decisions. And it's much more emotional than it is rational. Because voters aren't policy wonks. They're not reading policy memos. They're tuning in maybe a couple minutes a week.
Well, do you think that's because, let me ask this. Is anger more of a better communication strategy than unity and getting things done?
Of course. That's why negative ads work. That's why we all talk about how we hate them, but they work. They're compelling. They infuse all of the original elements of television that made television addicting and popular. It still makes it, popular. It's confrontation, drama, sensationalism, provocation, and humor. All those things are like weapons in politics and campaigns and messaging specifically. Especially when in our situation, President Biden was really unpopular in 2022. Inflation, the cost of things was at a all-time, I think, 40-year high. And so we were expecting some big red wave. But midterms tend to be an answer to the question, and it's either a yes or no. Do you like how things are going or not? And the people who don't like how things are going are much more motivated to turn out. But events can have huge impacts on elections. You saw this in 2002 when George W. Bush was able to keep his majorities in the House and Senate, grow them. You saw this in 2006 after Hurricane Katrina and in the really bad days of the Iraq War. Then the Iraq War turned unpopular. And a lot of Republican corruption, the Jack Abramoff scandal, Mark Foley, Tom DeLay, all these scandals were hitting all at once. And it was sort of like this perfect timing for people to really say, we've had enough. Blue wave is coming. And that's exactly what happened. And these events have much more impact, I believe, than statistics, performance, or how you feel about the economy. I think people like to say that, but I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea. I think in 2004, the pivotal battleground state was Ohio. But it had one of the worst unemployment rates in the country. And that didn't matter to people. But they did have a same-sex marriage referendum on the ballot too. That mattered. That drove people, that motivated people, because it's polarizing, right? Polarizing is conflict, and conflict sells, provocation sells.
We're in a brand new era of that, with algorithms pushing out content that's going to bring you back for more.
Not only that, but we have a president who uses the power of the bully pulpit multiple times a day. He uses the advantages the office affords to him to communicate with people who voted for him, who didn't vote for him. He just communicates all day long.
Even if it's bad communication, is it still good? To his own belief, any type of comms is good comms, as long as they're talking about you.
I think what he does inherently understand is how the news works. And that if you want people to focus on what he's doing, he has to drive the news, no matter what that is. He has to drive attention to him. He's very good at that. And by him, to his agenda. Now, what he also is very good at is he has his hand on the pulse of culture. And all politics is downstream of culture. And that's why he comments on things that you wouldn't expect presidents to publicly make statements on. Like, for example, I always use this example, the Sydney Sweeney controversy.
Over the jeans?
The fact that he had an opinion, that's because all your neighbors were talking about, all your friends were talking about it, and he knows that everybody's talking about is that. So he's going to have an opinion, whereas most politicians would never think to even insert themselves into a cultural debate.
Why would you?
Right? Well, but the reason why is that the people who are going to vote are also paying attention to real issues at home. They're paying attention to, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say real issues. Their attention span is only so much for politics, but their attention does go to drama and cultural divisions and cultural controversies like that. And he knows where the attention is, and he goes and finds it. Whereas most politicians, it's in their instinct, it's in their character, it's in their nature to avoid any sort of controversy, to stay away from it, to disengage. Trump's instinct is to always engage.
Do you think that people have had enough of that kind of tactics that he's deploying, or are they even subconsciously thinking about that?
Yeah, I always tend to think that there's a fatigue with him because he does try to drive the attention economy himself, and everything can be about him, whether he wants it to or not. It just is. It's a function of the news business and their priorities and their bottom lines. And it's a function sometimes of him. I think what he's done in terms of changing expectations voters have for their candidates in terms of plain spokenness, relatability, authenticity, I think that's a good thing. And accountability, by the way, because while we will never know, like transparency, we'll know down the road. It's too early to tell. But I could probably say he's the most accessible president to the media of my lifetime.
He's constantly putting himself in front of cameras.
Correct. But that is a risk. And he doesn't see it like that. He sees it as an opportunity. That's why he does it multiple times a day. And our White House, you'd be hard pressed to get a question to the president, I don't know, once every month, maybe a couple of times a month. And when you're talking about small d democracy, accessibility and the free press go hand in hand for accountability. And when you're hiding from the press, when you're not engaging, when you are purposefully disengaging, it's a real disservice not only to the country but to yourself.
But if the pro of accessibility is outweighed by or counterweighted by truth, like let's just say that you're putting yourself in front of cameras all the time and every other couple of paragraphs or sentences are lies or misinformation. I mean, does it really matter that you're accessible?
Yeah, absolutely. Because remember, it doesn't matter what the messenger is saying in order for people to form an opinion or to form an impression. So it's on the responsibility of the people providing the transparency, the media, that if somebody says something that's not true or that is inaccurate, it's their just responsibility to correct the record or to ask for correction and follow up. Like that's the way it's always been. But his words still have a huge amount of impact on people, which is why it's important for the media to play referee.
What lessons do you think Democrats have learned in the decade of Trump in terms of messaging?
I think the biggest thing is authenticity and plain-spokenness. There's some lessons that I don't think they have learned. I think they are starting to see there are some Democrats and candidates and staffers, because it's a cultural problem among the staff too, to be inherently distrustful of the media and disengage and less transparent. That's changing a little bit. There are politicians who are leaning in more to untraditional ways to communicate. Again, sometimes it looks so gimmicky because they keep using these scripts and it looks rehearsed. And Trump is anything but rehearsed, which is what people crave, is that authenticity. I think Democrats as a party understand it, but they don't know how to get there because culturally, again, it goes back to culturally in my party, the generation of staffers that currently work in the consultant class and in the staffing class are much more inherently distrustful because they want control, and being able to control the content they believe is safer. They always want to get to safe ground, and it's completely a risk-averse operation. And in the end, again, like I said about Biden, it didn't allow him to really expose his strengths, which was his ability to relate and connect through emotion, through human events, through human tragedy, through grief. When you control the content so much that you don't get to draw out who the person is as a human being, it does the candidate a huge disservice, because in the end, people want to know that they can relate to you. They want to think that they want to know, or they want to be able to say, oh yeah, they get me. And oh yeah, I can relate to that. But you can't do that in rehearsed sound bites or from a teleprompter.
Who do you think is doing that effectively right now in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party? Who's not the president?
It's a great question. I think in terms of like their communication skill overall, I think Rahm Emanuel does that very well. I think he's really smart and has answers to everything that are logical, make sense.
For those who don't know, Rahm is former mayor of Chicago and Obama chief of staff.
Yeah. Yes, and former ambassador to Japan, who might be running for president. So I think he's a really good communicator, very clear. He's the only Democrat who's been willing to take a position on some very controversial cultural issues. I think Rahm, like myself, understands that culture is downstream of politics, that in order to get people to trust you on the economy, they need to trust that you're not some fringe lunatic and that you have similar cultural views as well. Voters will always forgive you if you make a mistake. They will always forgive you for your vulnerabilities or even changing your mind. But they won't forgive fear or phonies or running away from hard questions. And Rahm, to his credit, is answering some of those hard questions.
What about a Republican?
I'd have to say probably, let's see. I think the vice president is a talented political athlete. I think he's a good communicator. I think Secretary Rubio is a really good defender, protector type of communicator. I think he's really good at selling the president's agenda and defending it. And he's come a long way since his first presidential campaign. He's much more confident, much more assured of himself, and much more displaying expertise in a different way than he did when he was first running. And so I think those two are actually very good communicators, and I'm sure there's more. I think Mike Lawler from New York, the congressman there, is a good communicator as well.
I want to go back to the question I had just before this, before I get you out on this. And that was, I had said, do you think the Democrats have picked up some of the tools that Trump has deployed, plain spokenness, also getting in front of cameras? Are Republicans picking up on this?
I think some are. I think not only in the Congress, in politicians, and also in the private sector, to be honest. I think they've learned that if they want to find a way into Trump's ecosystem, that they have to they can't just ask for a meeting. They've got to go communicate in a very public way and tell a story. Some of them are doing more of that. I think Republicans are doing a better job at actually going on riskier news platforms than Democrats are. I mean, there's a few exceptions here and there. I think Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg do a decent job of going into unfriendly territory. But my thing is that our candidate, or any candidate, should be able to go on Rachel Maddow and Jesse Waters. Because if you have core beliefs and opinions, then you have no trouble defending or amplifying them in either partisan setting. And we have to get more candidates who are comfortable communicating in uncomfortable environments.
Last question I have for you, if somebody wants to be a more informed voter this cycle, what should they pay attention to? What red flags might they want to, pick up on?
It's a good question. It's important to separate fact from opinion and editorial. I mean, personally, if I want to be informed, I would avoid cable news, my old industry. It's a little bit more of a party ecosystem in one direction or the other.
And depending on what hour of the day those shows are up to. You get more editorial shows later in the evening, right?
Well, the opinion pages tend to be in the evening or in the mornings. I would say that used to be the case. I would say less so now, that they have both found their markets and are pursuing their audiences through, again, what sells, provocation, conflict, what gets impressions and eyeballs. And that is, those are their businesses, right? They're private cable news companies, so they can do that. But, read things that you wouldn't typically read, like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. Read the actual reports coming out from Congress or the White House and make your own judgments. And then be curious. The only thing you have to do is be curious. Be curious enough to want to find out the root of some challenge, some policy goal or challenge or some accomplishment. You can get to the truth. It's all out there. You just have to be curious about it.
Curiosity never killed the cat. Michael, I know you're a cat lover, so
and
that
I
was
have
for
several.
You. I know. Wait, how many are you up to now?
I don't want to talk about it.
Oh, is it more than 5?
Let's talk about that
Let's
later.
just say curious on that front. Okay.
You can remain curious until next time.
Okay, fair enough. Michael LaRosa, thank you for joining Byline. How can people get, or at least follow you the best? Social media, where?
Twitter or X on Michael LaRosa DC.
Perfect. All right, Michael, thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Michael, very experienced in democratic politics and communications, the strategy, and how all of these messages are put together and considered, how they're tweaked, and how politicians ultimately can juggle pushback or, any praise from it and forge ahead to advance any policy interests, but possibly fundraise, get elected, etc. So, with that, thanks for going beyond the headlines again here on Byline with Ben Dennis. I'm going to sign off here. I hope you will tune into the previous episodes and the future ones too. I'm excited about them. You know where to find me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, the Twitter, X, Broadcast Ben. I'm all over. Feel free to give Oliver, my dog, a shout out too. He's there. If you want a break from all the news, he's squishy and cuddly, and he's a droopy little dude. Anyway, have a great week, everybody. See you later. Take it easy.